Dannie Abse is one of the greatest poets of modern Wales and modern Britain. For 7 decades he has written verse that is moving, haunting, funny and always distinctive. Born into a Jewish family in 1920s Cardiff, he has lived almost all of his adult life in London, but Wales is never far away in his work. For many years, Dannie Abse pursued twin careers as poet and doctor. Where the two disciplines met, the results were unforgettable.
Leave my soul alone. Leave my soul alone. It's a shuddering moment, actually, when you first hear it.
In later life, personal loss added a new note to Dannie Abse's work. Today, his words still have the power to stir emotions, challenge ideas, and win awards. This is the story of one of the most extraordinary of all Welsh writers. Home for Dannie Abse is Golders Green in North London. Though proudly Welsh, he has lived here in the same house for nearly 60 years. In his 10th decade, his poetry remains unique and as vivid as ever.
In the mildew of age, all pavements slope uphill. Slow, slow, towards an exit. It's late, and light allows the darker shadow to be born of it. Courage, the ventriloquist bird cries. A little god he is, censor of language. Remember Plain Hardy and Dandy Yeats in their inspired, wise pre-dotage? Well, I think you're pretty invisible. All people are pretty invisible, and so you're exiled almost from general life. You know, it's difficult walking uphill. It's all sorts of aches and pains when you walk, and you want to sleep in your own bed. You don't want to go away. Your life becomes very restricted. And I thought, well, I was very happy to write about old age because that's a subject, as you rightly said, other poets haven't dealt with it hardly at all. I don't think old age. So I'm very happy talking about walking uphill and thinking back, because that's what you do. I, old man, in my new timidity, think how profligate I wasted time. Those yawning postponements on rainy days. Those paper hat hours of benign frivolity. Now time wastes me, and there's hardly time to fuss for more vascular speech. The aspen tree trembles as I do. And there are feathers in the wind. Quick, quick, speak, old parrot. Do I not feed you with my life?
Speak, Old Parrot is Dannie Abse's 14th volume of poetry. Published in his 90th year, it marked him out as perhaps the oldest as well as the finest major poet at work in Britain.
Danny's been at the centre of poetry in Britain for 50 years. I mean, he published his first book. His first book was accepted when he was a medical student, in the 1940s. And Danny's been especially important to people in Wales, to writers in Wales, to poets in Wales. In a way, he's been our man in London, sort of cultural literary ambassador in London. I think he's a remarkable writer and an important writer for all of us.
Dannie Abse was born in Cardiff in 1923 into a Welsh Jewish family. His mother was a Welsh speaker from the Swansea Valley. His father ran small cinemas in industrial South Wales towns. There was an elder sister, Holder, but it was Danny's brothers, Leo and Wilfred, who determined the course of his life.
I didn't like poetry at school. Poetry at school was all about lesser celandines and daffodils, which didn't appeal to me. But Leo was very much involved with the Spanish War, the Civil War that was going on, and inflamed my idealism, youthful idealism. And he would take magazines of political nature, and in them you'd find poems which were about Spain and about the war and about injustice. And so I suddenly saw that poetry didn't have to be about blades of grass and daisies.
In 1940, Dannie Abse, urged by his brother Wilf, moved to London and began training as a doctor. But Dannie devoted as much time to poetry as he did to medicine, and when he was just 21, his first collection was accepted by a major London publisher. One of his earliest poems also proved to be one of his best-loved and most enduring. A wedding song, both universal and intensely personal.
Epithalamion. Singing, today I married my white girl, beautiful in a barley field. Green on thy finger a grass blade curled, so with this ring I thee wed, and send our love to the loveless world of all the living and all the dead. Now no more than vulnerable human, we more than one, less than two, are nearly ourselves in a barley field, and only love is the rent that's due, though the bailiffs of time return anew to all the living but not the dead. Shipwrecked, the sun sinks down harbours of a sky, unloads its liquid cargoes of marigolds, and I and my white girl lie still in the barley. Who else wishes to speak? What more can be said by all the living against all the dead?
I lived in Swiss Cottage. I found it exciting, and it was a very promiscuous time, and in many ways. And into that area came one called Joan Mercer, whom I fell in love with. Yeah. I had a play on at Rudolf Steiner Hall, a terrible play. And I had made a date, I always remember, one of the things I should be ashamed of. I made a date with the main actress after the first night that we were going to go out. And then Joan turned up in the audience, and I went with Joan. And I don't remember the name of the girl. She's probably dead by now. It's named Betty Dodds. I don't suppose she ever forgave me.
In 1951, Dannie Abse and Joan Mercer married in a union that was to last a lifetime.
Come then, all you wedding guests, green ghosts of trees, gold of barley, you blackbird priests in the field, you wind that shakes a pansy head fluttering on a stalk like a butterfly, come the living and come the dead. Listen, flowers, birds, winds, whirls, tell all today that I married more than a white girl in the barley. For today I took to my human bed flower and bird and wind and world and all the living and all the dead.
There's a kind of universality in the best of Danny's poems. How many weddings have used his Epithalamion, one of the great love poems, marriage poems in the language? I mean, we're talking Shakespeare done here. This is a major, major poet in the poem in the English canon. That comes from his personal life, his very personal joy, the fulfillment of his married life, and we respect that. We respect him for sharing that with us.
By the early 1960s, Dannie Abse was living in Golders Green, in the house that would become a lifelong home. He and Joan had 3 children, and Dannie was a practicing doctor. a specialist at a Soho chest clinic. As a poet, he had largely disowned his early work, too heavily influenced, he said, by the flamboyant style of Dylan Thomas. But a new, more conversational tone was starting to attract high praise. And soon, Dannie Abse was taking his poetry to the people in an innovative way.
At that time, poetry readings were very formal, and you were kind of called up onto a stage and you read into silence, and you probably sat down into silence. Here there was laughter and clapping and just bonhomie. People were there to enjoy themselves, and I think the jazz created this fantastic setting.
You all probably know the poem by Edward Thomas called Addlestrop. This poem is called Not Addlestrop.
Dannie could make people laugh and he could make people cry, and his poems do that. There's a great wit in them and a great subtlety.
For my part, under the clock, I continued my scrutiny with unmitigated pleasure, and she knew it, she certainly knew it, and would not glance at me in the silence of Not Addlestrop.
The poetry and jazz concerts continued for over a decade, touring the length and breadth of Britain, with Dannie Abse one of the star turns. Even major London venues were sold out.
The Daily Herald, which was a national newspaper at the time, said the day 3,000 people listened to poetry. I call that a bit of history, and it kind of in its way it was.
Between writing poetry and taking it on tour, Dannie Abse was holding down a day job in medicine. But for a long time, it seemed as though his two worlds would never meet.
After a poetry reading one day, one occasion, somebody said that you couldn't tell from your poetry you were a doctor, and I thought, well, that's so. And I thought I should try and use that, some of the material, some of the experiences I'd had, to confront something that was rather traumatic very often. And I always felt that poetry should be an immersion into reality, not an escape from reality, and that part of my reality was medicine.
Dannie Abse hit a rich seam with his medical poems, which remain among his most celebrated and haunting work. One poem, in particular, became a sensation on the page and in performance.
In the theatre. Sister saying, soon you'll be back in the ward. Sister thinking, only 2 more on the list. The patient saying, thank you, I feel fine. Small voices, small eyes. Nothing untoward. Though soon he would blink again and again, because of the fingers of Lambert Rogers, rash as a blind man's, inside his soft brain. If items of horror can make a man laugh, then laugh at this. 1 hour later, the growth still undiscovered, ticking its own wild time. More brain mashed because of the probe's braille puff. Lambert Rogers desperate, fingering still. His dresser thinking, Christ, 2 more on the list, a cisternal puncture and a neural cyst. Then suddenly, the cracked record in the brain. A ventriloquist voice that cried, you, sir, leave my soul alone, leave my soul alone. The patient's dummy lips moving to that refrain, the patient's eyes too wide. And shocked, Lambert Rogers drawing out the probe with nurses, students, sister petrified. Leave my soul alone, leave my soul alone. That voice so arctic and that cry so odd had nowhere else to go, till the antique gramophone wound down and the words began to blur and slow. Leave my soul alone. To cease at last when something other died, and silence matched the silence under snow.
Leave my soul alone. Leave my soul alone. And you suddenly have, it's a shuddering moment actually when you first hear it. I think his own medical world gave him a sense of the unknowability of the human body. It's always a very humbling profession, because you can't help everybody, and sometimes you have to decide whether to tell them what you've discovered. Sometimes not, and then people die. I mean, he was at the sharp end of experience, really, every day.
Dannie Abse was riding high, one of the most popular serious poets in Britain. His books sold in the tens of thousands. He was in demand as a performer, a talker, a presenter. He even toured America, promoted by Dylan Thomas's former agent there as the next great Welsh poet.
They're absolutely fantastic, I think.
And I can recommend them very highly. I enjoy them very much.
But Dannie Abse, the London poet and London doctor, never completely left Wales behind. One place in particular haunted his memory.
One time in my life, I earned enough money to think of buying somewhere where Joan and I could go, and the family could go, and of course the place I wanted to go to was Ogmore. I think I was conceived there, and all my childhood was there, and it was also part of Wales, and I have felt always a connection to Wales. Joan at first was reluctant to go to Ogmore. She thought it rained too much. But in the end, she loved the place as much as I did. A letter from Ogmore by sea. Goodbye, 20th century. What should I mourn? Hiroshima, Auschwitz. Our friend Kami said, thank forgetfulness, else we could not live. Thank memory, else we'd have no life. Goodbye, 20th century. What shall I celebrate? Darling, I'm out of date. Even my nostalgia is becoming history. Those garish come-on posters outside the cinema announced the famous I've never heard of. So many other friends too, now like Kami, have joined a genealogy of ghosts. But here, this mellow evening on these high cliffs, I look down to read the unrolling holy scrolls of the sea. They are blank. The enigma is alive. And for the present, I boast, thumbs in the lapels, I survive. Delightful Eros still holds reason a long zigzag on a taut leash. I'm still unsettled by the silence in framed pictures, foreground and background, or the mastery of music over mind. And I hail the world within a word. I do not need to be a fabulist like Iolo, who from this same coast would see 7 sails where there was but one.
Dannie belongs to Wales. And, you know, there are poems and in the prose he talks about that M4 corridor. It's kind of umbilical cord that can't be cut. He's maintained that house in Ogmore and had a foot in Wales, and he's needed that. But it's a foot in Glamorgan specifically. Almost Cardiff, definitely Wales, but certainly Glamorgan. That's where his roots are.
Life in Ogmore by Sea began to give rise to a new vein of poetry. The remoteness of the village, the ebb and flow of the tide, the emergence and recession of Tusker Rock, wrecker of ships, all found their way into the verse.
Goodbye, 20th century, your trumpets and your drums, your war wounds still unhealed. Goodbye, I must leave you, Dolly. Goodbye, Lily Marlene. Is the past always a future? Will there always be a jackboot on the stair, a refugee to Rome? A man with no roots is lost like the darkness in the forest, and it costs 100 years for a hiding place to become a home. Now, secular strangers come, sealed in Fords and Nissans, a congregation of cars to this opening estuary, so various, so beautiful, so old. The tide is out, and from the sleeping, reeled-in sea, not from the human mind's vexed fathoms, the eternal, murderous, fanged Tusker Rock is revealed.
I think that the tone of voice of the speaker is everything. He can judge almost exactly the kind of voice that we want to listen to, speaking of the most solemn things. And that includes some of the humour that you need with that. I think it's that exquisite ear for tone of voice that is his greatest achievement, and that's fundamentally metaphysical. It's not the images that makes the metaphysical poets, it's the address to eternity and flesh at the same time.
As Dannie Abse entered his 80s, life and art was something to celebrate. His collection, Running Late, showcased a new, lighter tone. It contained several poems addressed to his wife, Joan, the lifelong partner for whom he had written Epithalamion 50 years earlier.
Well, Dannie was the great poet able to write about married love. There are very few people who can do it. It's very difficult, and he does so with total conviction. It was a theme right the way through from Epithalamium. Joan and he were both very good looking when they were young. There's a picture of them both together. She was very, very pretty, very hospitable, very warm, and very intelligent. She was a good art historian. They were very close. He always travelled with her, and if people didn't invite her to, he didn't go.
In 2005, Dannie and Joan were driving home to Ogmore. On the M4, their car was hit from behind. Joan did not survive.
When I came back to London, I think I was in Nam, really, and I lived as a monk, really, for 3 years, and didn't give readings, wouldn't go away, and turned down occasions. I had post-traumatic stress, really.
In a way, the worst possible thing that could have happened to Dannie was to lose Joan, and that did happen in a bizarre, silly car accident. At one point, I remember him saying, hope he doesn't mind me repeating this, that he felt that, he wouldn't write again. Well, we all knew that wasn't the case. Real writers, and Dannie is a real vital writer, they don't stop writing. And that's what gives life meaning.
In an attempt to cope with his loss, Dannie began to keep a journal. 2 years later, it was published as The Presence, a book that since has helped many people in their own times of grief. The Presence was also a poem, one of many Dannie Abse wrote for Joan after her death.
Though not sensible, I feel we are married still. After 4 years, survival guilt endures. I should have said this, could have done that, and your absent presence has left a weeping scar. Like a heartbeat, you are indispensable. Each year, I think, the cries of the dead retreat, become smaller, small. Now your nearness is far. And sometimes I sense you're hardly there at all. When in company, when my smiles persist, your distance briefly is like the furthest star. It's when I'm most myself, most alone, with all the clamour of my senses dumb, then, in the confusion of time's deletion by eternity, I welcome you, and you return improbably close, but of course you cannot come.
His poems about Joan and about her death and his grief for her are the most wonderful and moving tribute to a marriage and to a love and to her. You could very easily hit some wrong notes in this territory, and Dannie does not. They're simple, but they're not simplistic. They're surprisingly unflinching. He doesn't turn his head away from some of the more difficult aspects or the more awkward aspects of grief, and they're so true to everyday life. It's a sad and beautiful thing that these poems have come about. But in terms of poems, you know, we should be grateful to have them.
Dannie Abse's extraordinary journey, artistic and personal, was not done though. The poetry kept on coming, and his most recent book, Speak, Old Parrot, is considered by many to be one of his best.
Not to mention J.H. Lawrence and the sanctity of...
Personally too, life moved on. Dannie met the writer Lynn Helmgard, and they became partners. Dannie Abse's life has spanned much of recent history, from Cardiff in the Great Depression to London in the age of banking crisis. His poetry has confronted horror and celebrated love. Writing back from the front line of old age, he has remained a one-off, located just where he always wished to be, way out in the centre.
What's exciting about Dannie Abse is that he's getting even better. It's all there. It's the work of a poet of humanity who has one foot, as Louis MacNeice advised, one foot in the grit of life and the other foot in his study. You can sustain your art across the years. You don't have to burn out like Keats and Dylan Thomas. You can carry on like Hardy and Dannie Abse.
He changes your life. I mean, it's not too grand a claim to say that the best writing of Dannie Abse is one of those ways of lighting your way through life. There are wonderful poems, there are wonderful pieces of prose. He's lived a long life, and we can be instructed by that.
Valediction. In this exile people call old age, I live between nostalgia and rage. This is the land of fools and fear. Thanks be, I'm lucky to be here.